the summary that you can take from this is that if you take 3 to 6 milligrams per kilo caffeine, it will provide 2.5% improvement for men and women if you do anything over 5 minutes of endurance activity. So that's the overall summary.
That Triathlon Show 234. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Dr. Ajmol Ali. He's an associate professor at Massey University in New Zealand, and one of the authors of the most up-to-date meta-analysis on the use of caffeine as an ergogenic aid in endurance sports. So in this episode, Dr. Ali discusses this meta-analysis, which includes 44 studies and more than 1,000 total participants, the findings that they came to, the practical applications for us athletes, and also some limitations and direction for future research on caffeine in endurance sports. So we really go deep here, but there will definitely be tons of great practical takeaways for anybody who wants to get the most out of their performance. In which case, caffeine certainly is something that is worth experimenting with, at least, because it has the potential to be an actual beneficial ergogenic aid. So we'll get right into the interview after thanking our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. They create electrolyte products of different strengths, and sodium in particular is the main electrolyte that we need to potentially replace, at least in longer events where we can actually run low on sodium and see some negative consequences from that in terms of reduced performance or nausea or cramping. And especially if you are somebody that loses a lot of sodium in your sweat, then this can be a really, really important thing. And the longer the race, the hotter the conditions, the more important it becomes and can become almost a make or break thing. One of many make or break things, of course, in a long event. But a good way to start is to take their free online sweat test under the free hydration plan tab in the menu bar, and that consists of 10 simple questions in a sort of quiz format about yourself, and that will actually, based on validated data with medical grade equipment, give you an estimate for how much sodium you might be losing in your sweat, and based on that you can then tailor your electrolyte intake to what that estimate is. And if you want to use Precision Hydration's electrolytes for that, then I would recommend that, of course. I love the products, and in addition to providing me with the sodium that I need, they're also very tasty, I want to say. But you can get 15% off with the promo code ThatTriathlonShow15. And then we have Roka that you can find on roka.com. Roka have in the last couple of years really made a big effort into designing and producing and manufacturing the world-leading glasses, including both sunglasses, but also now moving into prescription glasses and prescription sunglasses for both performance in sport, but also outside of performance, the day-to-day. So now they have a big range of products in all of those subcategories of eyewear that are really top of class when it comes to innovation and design and quality of build and so on. So check them out, and you can get 20% off your order with the promo code that you can find on roka.com/TTS. Now, without any further ado, let's get into the interview with Dr. Ajmol Ali. Welcome to That Triathlon Show, Ajmol. How are you doing today?
I'm very good, thank you. Halfway around the world, so I really appreciate the time to talk to you and explain about some of my research.
Yeah, it will be a really good one. I've talked a bit about supplements in general, or ergogenic aids in endurance sports before, but never done anything specific on caffeine, which is what we're going to talk about here. You've basically put together the latest and greatest meta-analysis on that specific topic. So can you talk a bit about the background of that topic in general and the meta-analysis that you put together?
Okay, thank you, Michael. First off, I must acknowledge my PhD student, Kyle Southwood, who did a lot of the background work on this paper, and also my colleague, Kay Rutherford-Markwick, who is co-supervisor for Kyle, and also someone who wasn't mentioned on the paper was my other colleague, Dr. Claire Badenhorst, who is quite a renowned Ironman triathlete herself here in New Zealand. Now, caffeine is an ergogenic aid, has been around for thousands of years. The Chinese actually used it for medicinal purposes about 5,000 years ago. And about 600, 900 AD, tea was starting to be used as a beverage in China. And the Han Dynasty there started bringing the caffeine into the mainstream or through tea. And it was around the 9th century in Ethiopia, of all places, where people started using balls of fat mixed with caffeine before long marches for their armies because of their, the ergogenic effects. And there's an interesting story about a goat herder who noticed that his goats, if they had a specific type of bean, ran around faster. And he mentioned that he had it himself. He talked to the monastery, and that sort of took it into Middle East and into Europe. And caffeine and coffee, as we know it, started from there. Now, in terms of the academic literature, Rivers and Weber in 1907, they presented a paper, the first paper of caffeine as an ergogenic aid at the Journal of Physiology, and they really showed the importance of caffeine for muscular capacity and improvements in performance. But they did talk about individual responses, and that's something I'll come and talk about a few times today in my talk here. Now, WADA, the World Anti-Drug Agency, they put caffeine on the ban list in 1984 because of some reported abuse of caffeine. This was published in a sports medicine journal, and as a result of those findings, WADA banned caffeine for athletes. And that ban was for about 20 years or so. And the amount of caffeine in urine had to be above 12 micrograms per milliliter of urine, which, to be fair, you have to have a lot of caffeine to actually see that in the urine. And because of its ubiquitous nature, everyone has caffeine, or 90% of the world's population have some sort of caffeine every single day. It got taken off the ban list in 2004, and that's sort of time when I just finished my PhD and I was looking for other projects to do, and I got interested in caffeine research. And I've had several studies since then. And there was a really nice study out of Spain by Juan del Joso, who put together a really nice study looking at 21,000 samples, urine samples of elite athletes between 2004 2008, and showed that 75% of athletes, so 3 out of all 4 athletes at this elite level, were consuming caffeine before or during competition. And only 0.6% of them would have failed the previously held, urine amount in the urine. So it just shows how ubiquitous it is. Yeah. And the other interesting thing, which is relevant for this discussion, is that it's mainly endurance athletes who take caffeine, and older athletes as well. So that's sort of where my initial research came through, and I've done several studies looking at in female athletes, in sports teams, in triathletes, in cyclists, and so on. And it's a really interesting area.
So when the ban was put in place, how much was known at that point about the performance benefits of caffeine? And how did that sort of then develop through the coming decades and until the time when you started working and studying caffeine? Okay.
Well, there was a train of thought that caffeine should not be used because it's a diuretic. Caffeine increases the amount of urine output. So the suggestion was you shouldn't be drinking coffee, you shouldn't be drinking tea for exercise performance. But in the late 70s, there was some work out of John Ivey and Dave Costeel's lab, and they showed that having caffeine increased lipid mobilization and utilization, and it improved performance. And their rationale for it was that because the body was utilizing the fat, it then spared the muscle glycogen, that's stored form of carbohydrate in the muscle, which then allowed people to improve their endurance performance. But more recent studies did not really show that. So although fat may be mobilized, yes, it might be able to get it in the system, but it doesn't really get taken up in the cells, and it doesn't get utilized, and it doesn't get used as a fuel. So more recent studies suggest other reasons for caffeine metabolism.
Can you go into that? What are those reasons?
Yeah, okay. So caffeine can actually be metabolized by most of the organs in the body, and it has lots of different types of effects, and because it's so complicated. We've suggested that it could do this for this type of performance, or it could do something else like the metabolic reasons. But the wealth of evidence and the consensus seems to be that caffeine is really a way to block the effect of a certain compound called adenosine. Now, adenosine, as athletes will probably know, ATP is the energy currency of the cell, adenosine triphosphate. So as you go through the day, adenosine levels build up, and it makes you feel tired. It makes you feel fatigued, and it's sort of a natural cycle so that you do go to sleep later on at the night. It gives you feelings of tiredness and lethargy. And as we exercise, adenosine breaks down as well, or ATP breaks down into adenosine, and that builds up again. And again, gives us these tiredness feelings. Now, caffeine has a very similar structure and shape, metabolic or molecular shape, to adenosine. And so basically, it masks the effects of adenosine. And we talk about caffeine as an adenosine antagonist. And what that means, basically, if adenosine is a police, it stops the police from working. And adenosine controls the other neurotransmitters like dopamine, like glutamate, like adrenaline, and so on into the brain. And it seems to be that it's the effect of caffeine on these neurotransmitters, or adenosine that controls the neurotransmitters, that seems to have the most impact with regards to performance. Now, caffeine is present in over 1,000 drugs available around the world, and because of its effects, its adjuvant effects, it can speed things up and it can slow things down. And so from a pain relief perspective, what caffeine does is reduce the feelings of tiredness, reduce the feeling of exertion, reduces the feeling of pain. And so you'll find it in most pain medication, caffeine. And so there's some of the reasons why we think, especially for endurance performance, that caffeine is a really good ergogenic aid.
And let's talk about dosage a little bit. What sort of doses are needed to see those performance benefits?
Okay, so in the general population, let's talk about how much caffeine is in different things. So a can of cola typically has about 35 to 40 milligrams of caffeine, whereas an energy drink, let's say a 500 ml of energy drink, might have about 140, 150 milligrams. And a cup of coffee typically, as a rule of thumb, because it depends how you brew it, about 100 milligrams of caffeine.
And a shot of espresso, what would that be?
An espresso, possibly about the same. Again, 120 milligrams of caffeine. But from an athletic perspective, we really talk about how much per kilo body mass. Obviously, if you're a much larger individual, you'll be able to metabolize more caffeine, whereas if you're a smaller individual, you'll have a relative size effect. So we talk about milligrams per kilo body mass. So the typical person, a moderate user of caffeine, might have 3 milligrams of caffeine per day. So if you're 70 kilos, that's about 210 milligrams of caffeine, maybe 2-3 cups of coffee. That's a moderate user around the world. Whereas what we call a naive user, one that doesn't necessarily use caffeine, might be less than 1 milligram of caffeine per kilo per day. So caffeine is found in all sorts of different things, in chocolate, in medication, as pills, obviously, in caffeine, in tea, in certain lemonades, in cola, and so on. So some people don't actually know how much they might actually be taking. A heavier user is someone who might be having over 6 milligrams of caffeine per day. And it seems to be that the Scandinavian countries and Netherlands and some of the European countries have a higher caffeine usage than other places around the world. Now, from a research perspective, most studies use a dose of between 3 to 6 milligrams of caffeine per kilo body mass. So for me, I'm about 70 kilos. I'd be having approximately 3 cups of coffee a day to maybe 4 or 5 cups of coffee. That's the equivalent amount of caffeine that we think is an ergogenic effect for most people. In our study, in our meta-analysis study, the mean of all the studies, of the 44 studies, is about 5 milligrams of caffeine per kilo body mass. And the type of caffeine that people use, obviously, caffeine can be found in about 60 different types of plant products, but we mostly get it for coffee, obviously through coffee beans, and tea through the tea leaves. But typically we use for research anhydrous caffeine, so that is the synthetic form. It's the chemical form, if you like. Anhydrous simply means without water, so it's in pill form, it's in powder form, and that's easy to control. It's also got no other contaminants. Obviously, for pre-workout supplements or energy drinks or coffee, there are lots of other things in there which could mask the effects, or which could cause adjuvant effects, which could cause, other things going on which we may not necessarily need. So for most research, we typically talk about 3 to 6 milligrams of caffeine that is used as a supplement for most athletes.
And in this research, it would generally be taken as a dose, as one sort of dose with, let's say, an hour to go before the competition or the event. Is that correct?
That is correct. And there is a whole body of research which looks at how long before the event you should take caffeine. It takes some time, just like anything. It takes time for the body to digest and absorb, assimilate, and then take it through to where it's required and then get metabolized. So typically for endurance athletes, we talk about 60 minutes before exercise. It seems to be for most people that's when the peak caffeine in the bloodstream will be available, and that's when it's available for obviously having the effects on the brain. But for some other athletes, for example, if you don't necessarily need caffeine for a long period of time, you can have it 3 hours before, or up to 3 hours before, if it's a much shorter duration activity, because that we definitely know then that caffeine will have its peak. The other thing to note is caffeine has a half-life of between 3.5 hours. So from its maximum, it takes between 3.5 hours to 3 to 5 hours, to get to 50% of that, and another 3 to 5 hours to get 50% of that. So the half-life of caffeine is about 3 to 5 hours. So hence, if it's a really short duration activity you're looking to do, take it a few hours before, maybe 2 or 3 hours before. If it's a more longer endurance activity, typically an hour before.
Yeah, that makes sense. So first of all, let's tease the results a bit, like just the general consensus of how big a performance benefit is the scientific consensus that caffeine can give in endurance events.
All right, well, that's a really good question, and I would like to take a step back and explain some of the aspects related to these types of studies so that our listeners can be aware of the information. So some of the other meta-analyses that's been performed in the past, they're either too old. One of them was done in 2004 when the studies there were still had the WADA ban, if you like. Others included energy drinks, so there's other contaminants in there, and some of them used time to exhaustion and other different methodologies. So we sort of said, well, if it's too old, it's obviously not necessarily going to be relevant for now. We want to just look at the effect of caffeine, not anything else, and we want to look at performance as opposed to capacity, because performance is related to the real world setting rather than a lab generated setting. And there are different types of reviews as well. So a narrative review is basically one where the reviewer or the writer or the authors will pick a topic and pick the relevant papers that they think is relevant for that and write their paper. And that's been critiqued because you can bring some bias in and pick the certain ones and so on. Whereas a systematic review, you have a specific method in place to look at all the studies available and then pick and choose. So it's a bit more objective. Whereas a meta-analysis, this is like a pooling of data. Most of these types of studies, Michael, are very hard to complete, very hard to recruit, and very expensive to perform as well. So we typically have relatively small sample sizes. So what a meta-analysis does is, if you get all your ducks in a row and can look at all the studies that have a similar sort of theme and similar methodologies, you can pool all their results. So going from a sample size of 10 subjects, you can go to 1,000, for example. So you can massively increase the sample size. And also in that, we can provide a bigger impact or more firm conclusions based on the available evidence. So this study that we performed was a meta-analysis. It's the most recent meta-analysis, and we went to really great lengths to try and figure out how best to design it and what to look for. And as a result of that, we had some strict inclusion criteria when we looked for the relevant papers. We only used studies that looked at caffeine, not caffeine and carbohydrate, not caffeine as a pre-workout supplement, not with energy drinks, not with coffee, and so on. So just looking at the effect of caffeine on its own. We also wanted to look at what typically people use. So we put a minimum amount of 3 milligrams per kilo body mass and above. That's what we wanted to look at. And we also wanted to look at time trial as opposed to time to exhaustion. Some of the earlier studies, they use time to exhaustion. So time to exhaustion basically is you run on a treadmill and go until you can go no more. I've done those sorts of studies, and it's not really real life. There's no end point. You just go however long you can. So with those sorts of studies, you can see massive differences between an experimental and a placebo trial. Whereas a performance type study or a time trial, there's a specific end goal, whether it's time or work output or distance. And so we chose the time trial type studies, either power output or performance time. And we also wanted to look at endurance exercise per se, because that's what most of the research suggests that caffeine will work on. And we chose as a minimum of 5 minutes of exercise.
And one note on the time trial versus time to exhaustion, I think that you actually wrote this in your paper as well, but in general, if we're talking about a sport like cycling where you can measure power, a 1% increase in power output corresponds to something similar in terms of improvement in time trial performance. Not exact, but something in the same of the same magnitude. Whereas a 1% increase in power output in a time to exhaustion test can lead to something that is an order of magnitude or more greater in the improvement in the time to exhaustion test. So let's say 20% or something. So that is what you're talking about, just for the listeners to be aware of why the time trials are probably the more accurate tests in terms of determining performance compared to time to exhaustion that can be quite sensitive and show perhaps too great effects rather than what they actually should be doing.
That's exactly right there. Everything you've said there is spot on. So when we have a definitive time, so if it's a 60-minute time trial and we want to see how much power output we can generate over that 60 minutes, or if it's a 40-kilometer time trial, we want to see how quickly we can get to 40 kilometers, we have a definitive end goal. And it's more realistic relative to what happens in the real world. And so typically people, the one that most researchers seems to use for time trial is the one that Asker Jukendrup has organized, a 60-minute, 1-hour time trial for cycling, and that's the one that's most utilized. And others might use like a 10-kilometer race on a treadmill as a time trial that way, but they're much more realistic, and they also usually come with a smaller change that you see in these sorts of experiments. And as you say, 1% improvement in a time trial equates to about 15% improvement in a time to exhaustion. So that's the thing. And the other thing that Will Hopkins, a renowned statistician, talks about is the minimum worthwhile effect. And typically for athletes and high performance athletes, it's about 0.5%. So if something can improve your performance by 0.5%, that's a meaningful difference in the real world. And so time trials are much, much better at that. And that's part of the reason why we were quite strict in our criteria for looking at these papers.
So how many papers did you then end up finding that met the inclusion criteria, and what was the pool number of study participants in those studies?
Great question. Thank you. So part of the thing about a meta-analysis is that we go through a systematic approach of searching for the papers, rating for them based on previously ordained criteria, and then giving them a ranking out of 10. And if any below 6 out of 10, then we don't even include those in our pool data. So they go through various things, and we do this independently. So two or more researchers will do this, and we agree on the final inclusion, and then we do the statistical analysis on all of those, and we look for the percent change. We also look at something called effect sizes to look at small or moderate or large effects from a statistical perspective. And in this particular meta-analysis, we found initially 1,392 studies that looked at caffeine or various elements of caffeine with endurance performance and or triathlete or whatever keywords that we utilized. It was quite a large number of keywords that we used. And after screening and removal, we finally ended up with 44 studies. And in those 44 studies, some of them had multiple trials, whether it was a power output trial or whether it was a time trial type trial. And so we actually ended up with 57 trials within 44 studies. That led us to about 1,001 participants. 82 were female, so just under 10% were female. And 639 were in the performance time, whereas about 350 were in the power output. So a range of studies looking at males, females, and power output and time to performance time. Sorry. The mean age of these participants was about 27 years old, and their VO2 max was 58 milliliters per kilo per minute.
And what about the sports, the distribution of different disciplines or modalities?
Okay. The vast majority, 75% of those studies, were cycling studies. Part of the reason for that is it's easier to undertake these labs. We've got more availability of cycloergometers and so on. There was only one triathlon study by Potgieter et al. In 2018. I'll mention their results later on. There are some of them which utilize mixed modality, and only a few that did running. So the vast majority were cycling studies. And the amount of caffeine given, I think I mentioned earlier, was 5, or the mean was 5 milligrams of caffeine per kilo body mass, given approximately 60 minutes beforehand. So that's typical. If you want a summary of all of that, typically we use cyclists who were given 5 milligrams of caffeine 60 minutes before their exercise, before their typically 60-minute of time trial activity.
Yeah. And one more comment, going back a bit to what you said with ranking and at least having a criteria of having at least 6 points. That's not a subjective ranking. That's a methodology that's been developed for this kind of studies. So, and you had 2 or was it more independent researchers that all evaluated these studies for this specific set of criteria that is generally accepted as the way to determine the quality of a study. So just to make clear that it's not a subjective thing that can introduce a lot of bias.
No, it's very, very good point. So a number of years ago, there was actually some physiotherapists who wanted to do this, and it's the Pedro scale came out of work done by physiotherapists. And there's a specific criteria that we're all objectively, so you could do it or anyone else could do it, pick the same thing, we follow the same method, we should get the same 44 studies. So it's an objective, non-biased way of finding these key articles. So
exactly.
It's a specific method in doing this.
Yeah. So let's get into the results then. What did you find when you pooled all of these studies and analyzed the magnitude of performance benefits, if they existed?
Yeah, great. So the key findings for us was a 2.26% improvement in time. Now, that doesn't seem like much, but as I said to you before, 0.5% is usually a typical smallest worthwhile effect for elite athletes. So 2.26 is a good finding there. Relatively small effect size of 0.28, but that is still it's still statistically significant. Also, we showed a 2.92% in power output. Again, a small effect size of 0.22, but still statistically significant. So overall, when we pool the data and we take the units out of seconds for time and wattage for power output, we see a 2.52% overall performance improvement. So based on the data on 1,000 athletes here across 44 studies, we show a 2.5% improvement as a result of taking 5 milligrams of caffeine in this time trial activities. And out of the 57 trials, 51 out of the 57 showed improvement in caffeine intake. Only 6 of them did not show improvement or showed negative improvement. So overall, the weight of evidence seems to suggest then that caffeine is a good ergogenic aid for endurance athletes.
Yeah, perfect summary. And you did an analysis as well where you investigated certain variables. For example, is there an impact on how much you benefit depending on whether you're a more well-trained in terms of a higher VO2 max athlete or a less well-trained athlete, also looking at some other variables. I think you looked at gender and perhaps some other ones. So can you just go into that, if there were any particular findings in that regard that you had?
That's a really good point, and we wanted to look at these covariables because it'd be interesting for listeners and for readers to say, well, if I'm of a higher trained ability and someone is less, do I get a better or worse outcome? Or if I'm male as opposed to female, or if I'm doing a longer activity or a shorter activity. And we put all of those covariates into our analysis, into a meta-regression analysis here, and we showed no association between the caffeine dose, between the oxygen uptake, between exercise duration or exercise mode. So in effect, the summary that you can take from this is that if you take 3 to 6 milligrams per kilo caffeine, it will provide 2.5% improvement for men and women if you do anything over 5 minutes of endurance activity. So that's the overall summary. And that's a good finding. It's quite simplistic in that way, that there's no effects of these covariables.
And one important point there is the amount of caffeine. So if we can assume that in general 3 to 6 milligrams give the same benefits, then it's probably better to err on the side of lower rather than higher because of the potential gastric upset that you might have from taking on too much caffeine. So that's a particularly important finding, I think, in terms of the practical take-home messages.
Definitely. And for these types of supplementation studies, and I do lots of them, we always look at what's the smallest amount that I need. And it might be from a cost perspective, it might be from a reduced side effect aspect, or, if you don't need to give something, why bother giving it? So there's an ethical concern as well. So we really look for what's the smallest amount that we need to provide an effect. So 3 to 6 milligrams can be quite large in terms of the amount for a person, but the key message from here is that's a range for these 1,000 people. What we need to do, and if you're a sports scientist working with an athlete, or if you're an athlete yourself, you need to experiment on yourself. Use the smaller amounts to start with, record how you are, because ultimately you're your own subject in your own study. Because of these individual variations, as I've mentioned, we always seem to find in caffeine. We'll touch upon that later on. We've given you a range. The science here has provided a rough range that seems to work. Now what you need to do is to make that precise for your individual requirements based on the various issues like your gender, like whether you use the oral contraceptive pill, whether you smoke, what type of activity you want to do, how habituated you are to caffeine, and so on. Yeah,
perfect summary. What are some open question marks that remain, and perhaps some limitations that this way of analyzing the ergogenic effect of caffeine has? Like, to give you an example of what I mean, for example, the mode of the event, we talked about most of these studies, 75% being cycling studies. What does that mean for the triathletes listening to this podcast? Are there any special considerations that they might need to consider?
As I said, from our meta-analysis, as long as it's over 5 minutes of endurance activity and it's predominantly aerobic activity that you're doing, it doesn't seem to matter if it's swimming or cycling or running. And the Potgieter et al. Study that was done on triathletes that were utilized in this, that was the only triathlon study. They had 26 participants who consumed 6 milligrams of caffeine 60 minutes before a triathlon, and they looked at caffeine performance benefits for each of the 3 legs of the triathlon and the overall performance. Now, there was no difference in the cycling or the running legs, but the swimming leg statistically improved by 3.7%, and then overall performance improved by 1.3%. So their conclusion from that study was that caffeine in small amounts, 3 to 6 milligrams, may benefit triathletes. So that's for a triathlon perspective. But as I said, the summary of all of our studies on 57 trials from 44 studies then is that as long as it's over 5 minutes, then you should get some benefit. Now, on a related note, on a different paper that we've wrote, we looked at 20 different studies that looked at time trial performance, and out of those 20 studies, 33% of the participants did not have any effect or had negative effect of caffeine. And that led us to other questions to say, what could that be? Why could some people benefit from caffeine, and why majority of people do benefit, but why are some people not benefiting? And that's a sort of question that we always ask ourselves with any supplementation study. Who are the responders? Who are the non-responders? Why do they respond? Why do they not respond? And how can we try and mitigate some of these individual variances?
So let's get into that then. What have you found in terms of that individual difference in response?
Yeah, that's a sort of questions that many people are trying to grapple with. And because caffeine is ubiquitous, lots of people have it already in their daily lives, and because it's found in lots of different ways, and it can impact in various ways, even for the same individual on different days. And something to note as a rule of thumb, the more tired you are, the more fatigued you are, the better the effects of caffeine. Because what that does is, I mentioned to you earlier about adenosine, the more adenosine we have, and caffeine can mask that, then you'll have better response as a result. So all of those things need to be taken into consideration. Some of the covariables for caffeine intake then are elite versus recreational. Most of these studies are still using recreational athletes. They're not using the creme de la creme right at the top, the international athletes who might be competing on the world circuit, who might be at the Olympics and so on. We just are unable to recruit those sorts of athletes into our studies. They are different. Physiologically, psychologically, they are a different beast to most of these recreational type athletes. That's something to be wary of. There are more recreational athletes than these really, really elite athletes, but it's something to consider. The other thing to note, as we said, that Del Coso et al. Paper showed that out of these 21,000 urine samples, 19% of those had other things in the urine as well. So co-utilization with caffeine. Part of the reason why, as I said, caffeine's adjuvant effects, it can help speed things up, and it can slow things down as well. There was an interesting article I read about the New Zealand Rugby League team. A few years ago, they went from New Zealand to the UK to perform in the Rugby League World Cup. And because of the time difference and the jet lag, they were having caffeine to train and to be able to play in the evenings. But then to go to sleep, they were giving them sleeping tablets. And unfortunately, what they didn't realize, the combination of those things, the caffeine actually made the sleeping tablets work differently. So they, in effect, were like having recreational drugs rather than going to sleep. So that was an interesting little article that caused a bit of a storm here in New Zealand. The other things that can impact on caffeine is smoking. So smoking increases caffeine metabolism, and age as well. So the older people have slower caffeine metabolism, and also gender. We've done some research on female athletes and male athletes, of course. Menstrual cycle changes. So even within a 28-day cycle, caffeine metabolism changes during the different phases, and contraceptive use changes caffeine metabolism as well. So if you're the typical half-life of caffeine is about 3 to 5 hours, it can be 8 to 12 hours and even more for women who athletes who are taking oral contraceptive pills. So all of these factors can confound the effect of caffeine. And in research, we always try and minimize the covariables so that we can really look at the effect of that treatment. But it's really hard to do, and it's hard to recruit for people at times. And so hence sometimes the science cannot always answer the specific question because of all the covariables that are involved.
Yeah, and that comes back to you need to test on yourself at the end of the day. In terms of the metabolism, what does a slower or faster metabolism mean for performance? I mean, if you have a slower metabolism and the half-life of caffeine is longer, does that just mean that, let's say you're doing an Ironman, you can potentially benefit from that for a longer time because you have a larger amount of caffeine in your body available? Or am I missing something there? Is it something else that's going on with the metabolism?
No, that's a really good point, Michael. And it's true from a theoretical perspective. That does make sense. But remember, the body doesn't do one thing at a time. There are all sorts of other things going on all at once, and that is part of the issue with some of these studies that we try and isolate everything and just look at one single variable, but the body does not look at one variable. There's all sorts of other things going on at the same time. So that's something to be wary of. Now, one of the things I didn't mention about the covariables was genetics, and I knew you were going to ask me specifically about genetics, so I sort of left it. So caffeine is metabolized, and for those of you who are not necessarily aware, metabolism is basically a combination of catabolism, which is the breakdown of products, and anabolism, which is the buildup of products, and the sum of those two is metabolism. So caffeine is broken down by the P450 enzymes that come out of the liver, and these P450 enzymes basically they're like the recyclers of the body, and they recycle the drugs. So over 75% of any drugs that we take are metabolized by these P450 enzymes that come out of the liver, whether it's alcohol, whether it's nicotine, whether it's caffeine and other such drugs. Okay, and the gene that codes for that is the CYP1A2 gene, which codes for these P450 enzymes, and this is responsible for more than 90% of caffeine metabolism. And you just mentioned about fast and slow metabolism. Well, the actual allele here, the two A's, the AA is found in 40% of people typically, and they're what we call fast metabolizers, whereas the heterogeneous AC allele in about 50% of people, and that's what we call a slow metabolizer. And then there are ultra slow, the two recessive genes, the C and C, 10% of the population are ultra slow, and they're the ones potentially who might be affected by caffeine and having caffeine in their system for a lot longer. I've talked to some cardiologists, and that's what they're really interested in, because it's these people who have very high levels of caffeine if they have it, and that can impact with their heart, and it can lead to ECG abnormalities and increase the risk of cardiovascular complications. So that's the sort of thing that can happen with some of the population. So caffeine metabolism is based on this CYP1A2 gene, and there have been some studies around the effect of different genotypes on performance based on caffeine. And one of the more recent studies used 101 cyclists. That was one of the largest sized studies with caffeine and genetics and exercise. And these 101 cyclists took part in a 10-kilometer cycling time trial, and they split the people into fast and ultra slow metabolizers. And what they showed was that there was a 5 to 7% improvement in performance from taking small amounts, so 2 milligrams of caffeine or 4 milligrams of caffeine in these fast metabolizers, the one with the AA alleles. Whereas there was a 13% decrease in the performance in the C and C, the ultra slow genotype. So that study showed then that the fast metabolizers are more likely to have a benefit from caffeine in endurance cycling, whereas the really ultra slow metabolizers are unlikely to have it. But other studies show no effect of genotype, using different types of doses, different men, female and mix, or different exercise modalities. So as I said earlier, yes, we can try and isolate the genetics part, but it mixes with other things, and so it complicates the issues. But we need more research to really try and navigate our way through these confounding variables. So that relates to caffeine metabolism, but it's not just about metabolism. And the CYP1A2 gene that codes for these enzymes that break down caffeine and then obviously get rid of it in your urine. The other aspect is, how does it get taken up into the cell? Because it's when it gets taken up into the cell, that's when it can do things within the cell itself. And as I mentioned before, caffeine really is an adenosine antagonist, and especially in the brain. So there's another gene, we call that the ADORA2A gene, and that relates to caffeine sensitivity. So as we know, adenosine slowly builds up during the day and leads to the downregulation of these certain neurotransmitters. So in effect, in other words, it polices how much of these neurotransmitters get into the brain. And dopamine is one of these key neurotransmitters. Dopamine gives us the high. It's that feeling of, feeling great. You're feeling like anything can happen. Some people call it the runner's high. Others might talk about euphoria. So pharmacologists call that state euphoria, and coaches might call it being in the zone. And that is what we try and push towards when we exercise. And caffeine can help us there because it blocks the adenosine and allows more dopamine into the cell. So DORA 2A codes for the sensitivity of that caffeine intake. And about 20 to 30% have the TT allele, and that gives you higher sensitivity to caffeine. Basically, that means that you potentially have better effects to caffeine, because you can change your baseline to what it would be afterwards. But it also comes at a cost. It increases lots of research shows that increases anxiety in these people, and because of that, they self-select and choose not to have caffeine as a result of that. If you're caffeine sensitive that way, whereas another 20 to 30% have the CC alleles, and that is a lower sensitivity. So they might have higher habitual intake of caffeine, but the downside of that is they have a less of an ergogenic effect. So if you don't take caffeine as much, you can have a better effect from it. Whereas if you're more habitually taking it, you're less likely to have an effect from caffeine. And that's sort of paradox that we have. And 45% or so have the heterogeneous CT allele there. And only one study so far has looked at the effect of the DORA. And this study in 2015, they had 12 females who took 5 milligrams of caffeine, 5 milligrams per kilo body mass of caffeine, 20 minutes, and then 1 hour before, 20 minutes of pre-fatiguing activity, cycling activity, and then they did a 10-minute time trial. And what they found was that the guys in the CT or the CC group, these lower sensitivity to caffeine, there was only 1 out of the 6 who showed improved performance, whereas 6 out of 6, all of the ones in the TT group, the ones who have a higher sensitivity to caffeine, they all improve their performance. So that's just one study so far. And, we need other studies to corroborate these sorts of findings. But it's some interesting information there that it's not necessarily how well you metabolize caffeine, whether it comes in and goes out again, but whether it gets taken up into your cells, and then whether how the body utilizes it in the cells itself, and especially the brain cells. So your interesting question earlier about ultra long distances or Ironman athletes could be very true. So it might be that if you're an DORA TT, so a higher sensitivity to caffeine, plus a really slow metabolizer, a CC with regards to CYP1A2, so you have a really slow release and it stays in your body for longer, and you take it up and it makes better effect when it gets into the cell, that might be the best sort of individual to have caffeine in the body for longer and provides better effects from much longer endurance distances. Whereas if you have this DORA 2A TT high sensitivity again, but a fast metabolizer, so the CYP1A2AA allele, you don't necessarily require caffeine for long periods of time, so it might be much better for shorter endurance events. So that sort of research is yet to be done. It's really, really challenging to find the right people because you don't know who they are in the population, and we have to then mitigate some of the other aspects, how much caffeine they have, whether they're smokers or not. We need to find the similar homogeneity in terms of their training status and other things like that. So it's really difficult to find, but one day we'll get this research done, and then we'll be able to hopefully answer that question that you just posed. So in a nutshell then, different genetics combined with different habits and different exercise durations and so on may then indicate how much dosage and what sort of timing before the event that you have. And as I said, certainly more research needs to be done in this area.
That is super interesting, and we could go very deep into this, but I do have a few follow-up questions. First, in terms of the CYP1A2 gene, the caffeine metabolizing gene, did a study that you mentioned with 100 cyclists only look at the two homogeneous alleles and not at the heterogeneous, kind of slow but not ultra slow metabolizer, or did I get that wrong?
The only data that I've got right now is on that. I'd have to chase it up again. It's been a while since I've read that paper, so I can't actually say, but I presume, if I was to assume anything, that they would have looked at all three combinations, because if you do one, you should do the other. But I would have to recheck the paper. I haven't got it at hand right now.
Okay. And the second, by the way, I can probably post a link to it in the episode show notes, so people can go and have a look at it themselves if they're interested, just as I will do with the meta-analysis itself. With the sensitivity on the other hand, what I was going to ask there is that there has been some talk about having to taper off caffeine for the last week or 2 weeks before a race to really see the benefits. And you mentioned there that people tend to self-select whether they are caffeine consumers or not based on the anxiety that the high sensitivity gives them. Are those two connected in some way, or are they disconnected?
No, very much so. So one of the things that we find is we can put ourselves into 3 different categories, like a naive user. So that means someone like myself. I don't drink tea or coffee. I don't take energy drinks. I barely drink any cola. So I'd be a caffeine naive user because I'm quite sensitive to it. And if I took caffeine as an ergogenic aid, which I have done, whether it's for academic work or sometimes for football purposes, but it really messes up my sleep. And it gives me sort of, anxiety-related issues. And so I only use it when I need to as an ergogenic aid, but that's it. Other people are most people around the world would be habitual users of caffeine. They have moderate doses and so on. And then we have the extreme amount of people who are very, very high users of caffeine. And for people like myself, if I have caffeine, yes, I can use it as an ergogenic aid. For the middle group, the habitual users, they might need to reduce a small amount of their caffeine, as you mentioned, taper off, but not too much, and then use it as an ergogenic aid. And their really heavy users will completely have to come down towards much lower levels if they really want to see any benefits, because otherwise they would have to take so much caffeine that it goes into the realms of toxicity, and we don't want that to happen. So the other thing to note is that just like any drug that exogenous drug that we have, when we take it away, we will undertake some sort of cold turkey. And the cold turkey for some people, if they take caffeine, is the jittery, is that emotional, is the behavioral sort of issues that they might have, and that might actually reduce their performance. So if you are going to taper off caffeine, make sure you do it well in advance to offset some of these cold turkey type effects before you use it as an ergogenic aid. And that will
makes sense.
Your risk of jitteriness and nervousness and things like that.
Yeah. I was just going to ask, how well established is this? Because I have been asked this question, and when I was looking into it, obviously not to the same degree that you have been doing, but I just saw a couple of different results on it. So I sort of thought that it's not necessarily super well established, but is your opinion then, and from what you've seen, that it is quite well established that if you are at least somebody who habitually consumes a larger amount of caffeine, you really do need to taper off to see as big an effect as you would want to?
That's very true. So there was a nice study in 2008 by Sockman et al., and they showed some arbitrary information about that. So if you're a person like me who doesn't take caffeine, what's the typical theoretical benefit from caffeine? If you're a normal caffeine user and you come off it and then taper and then use it, it shows you theoretical aspects there. And also, if you're if you just carry on maintaining your normal levels and then you have the caffeine as an ergogenic aid, it just will not have any effect. So it's a nice paper, and I can pass you the link later on so that the readers can and the listeners can see the paper. And it gives them some nice graphs to show that. And from that, I've actually prepared a table, which I'm more than happy to share with you, which shows the acute and effects, and then the tolerance related things, and then the caffeine cessation, and it is quite clear what sort of things happen to individuals. Most individuals, obviously, everyone has individual effects, and I'm happy to share that with you, which you can share with your listeners.
That would be brilliant. Thank you. And then the final follow-up question, I guess, is genetic tests are now available for consumers, and the caffeine genes are some of the genes that are generally tested for in these types of consumer-directed tests. Would your recommendation be that if somebody wants to find out how to optimize their endurance sport performance, that is a good thing to do, to figure out that what your genetics are in those particular genes? Or what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, the whole genomic analysis is very complicated. We're still very early days in this, but the business for it has increased. I've read a report saying that it's going to be worth about 10 billion US by in the next couple of years. That's how big that lifestyle genomic testing is going to become. And so people are doing it. And we are still, as I said, in the earlier stages of that. My hope, I guess, from an athletic perspective, is that we will start shedding some light on that, because as you're very well aware, and I'm sure many athletes are as well, that many people respond to certain things. For example, creatine. Lots of athletes might take it, but 25-30% of people, they've got sufficient creatine in their bodies, or some other reason means that they're not going to have an effect from it. Similarly with caffeine, as I've said, 33% of users, based on these results of 20 studies that we've seen, show no effect for some people. So could it be a genetic rationale or reason for that? And if you undertake the analysis and find the information, we might be better able to say, well, athlete A is better with this supplement, athlete B is better with this supplement, athlete C is better with that supplement, rather than a traditional way. It's, you're all going to get this, you're all going to get, drug A, drug B, and drug C, or supplement A, supplement B, supplement C, and hopefully it works for you. So it's about trying to fine tune the best supplement based on the genetics. I think we're still a long way away from that yet. More research certainly needs to be done in that area. I'd just like to segue into one of the studies, or some of the studies, my PhD student Kyle Southwood is doing in this area. So we're looking at, it's the first study that's looking at the effect of the CYP genes and the DORA genes together on endurance performance. We're using triathletes and cyclists and runners, and it's been a long road trying to recruit sufficient people, because we want to look at the interaction of the different mix of fast and slow metabolizers, and also the caffeine sensitive, high sensitivity and low sensitivity aspects, and also combine that with the timing of caffeine and the dosage of caffeine received in these trained athletes, to try and explore some of these things in a bit more detail. So hopefully some of what we're doing here, plus some of the work that's been done all around the world, because caffeine is one of the most popular ergogenic aids, we might shed some light into these areas in the future.
All right. Yeah. So at least it sounds like it's not a complete clear yes, you should go and get a genetic test. You might gain some interesting information, but would you say that you can get that information by just trial and error yourself, being your own experimental one?
You've hit the nail on the head there, Michael. Yes, ultimately, yes, from a scientific perspective, we want to be able to do work that we use a small sample size and then we generalize out to populations. But ultimately for athletes, it's an N of one. It's a sample of one. What's going to work for you, what you record, how you felt, how you performed, work with your athlete, work with your coach to find out what the best thing is for you in that particular situation. And that's the best advice I can give right now. Genetics may play a part in the future. It might give you some idea, but it is still very, very new in that space.
Right. So let's wrap this up. Can you just summarize the practical takeaways for the listeners, endurance athletes? What would the recommendations be around using caffeine as an ergogenic aid?
Great. So I'll put this into 3 or 4 different points here. First thing is depending on habituation. So whether you're a non-user of caffeine or a moderate user or heavy user, if you're a non-user, you certainly need to test the efficacy. You need to test whether caffeine will work for you, because yes, it might help you on a one-off, but then if it reduces your sleep and if it makes you ill in other ways, then it's going to have knock-on effects on subsequent training, subsequent competition. So always test the efficacy of this supplement or any other supplement well in advance of your competition. If you're a moderate user, reduce the amount that you might take, taper off, as you've said, but not completely remove, because it comes with those cold turkey effects. If you're a heavier user of caffeine, above 6 to 8 milligrams per kilo body mass per day, then you need to limit that amount. Otherwise, you will get no effect of the caffeine as an ergogenic aid. So that's the habituation side. In terms of timing, I think I alluded to it before. If you've got really shorter endurance events, then you can take the caffeine further away from your performance up to 2 or 3 hours beforehand. Whereas if it's a longer duration activity, about 1 hour seems to be the consensus on that front. And in terms of dosage, again, it depends on the individual and the effect required. The genetics might play a part in that, and more evidence needs to come onto that. But if you do take the test and you know what you are, then you might wish to consider how much you take there. Habituation, I've just mentioned, the training status as well, and some of the other aspects like whether you're female and have OCS, contraceptive steroids, whether you're a smoker, and so on. In terms of what type of caffeine to use, the pill form or the tablet form or the powder form is much better. You're only taking caffeine, nothing else, and just be wary of the dosage in there. Obviously, you can have poisoning from anything, but especially with caffeine, and so check and double check how much you're taking. But the caffeine powder seems to be better than coffee or energy drinks or anything else like that. And as I said, the genetic analysis may give you some idea with regards to types of where you are heading, but more evidence needs to come out to really specifically say, well, if you're X and Y genotype, you definitely need to do this.
In terms of the mode of ingestion, a lot of sports nutrition companies seem to offer liquid form caffeine. What's your take on that, as opposed to powder and pill form?
Part of the reason why the pill and the powder is it's easier to control. You can spoon it, you can weigh it, you can do that, and that's what we use for our research purposes. In liquid form, yes, you can. Of course, you can take it, but as long as it doesn't have too many other things in there. So, for example, energy drinks have a whole host of other things in there that we sort of don't necessarily want people to take. And and the other thing for really elite athletes, if you know that it's just caffeine in that pot that you've got, well, it can't be contaminated with anything else, especially when it comes to drug testing and so on.
Yeah, I think that that is what I personally use Science in Sports caffeine shots. So it's not an energy drink or a coffee or anything like that. It's just like caffeine in liquid. I mean, I'm sure there's some sugar and stuff like that in it, flavors, but it's Inform Med Sport tested and validated, so it should be safe. So, and those are the kinds of shots that I see some other sports nutrition companies offering as well. So generally just caffeine and some hopefully harmless substances.
Mm-hmm. Good point there, Michael. And I've also done research on caffeine and carbohydrate. Now, the caffeine and carbohydrate thing came out a few years ago. It was the Australian Institute of Sport, a sports nutritionist by the name of Greg Cox. I think he did his PhD on that. And what they found was that athletes were having flat cola. So they take the carbon out and drink the flat cola drinks, and they showed improved performance. And they did a study on that, and they showed individual effects of added carbohydrate on time trial performance, individual effects of added caffeine on time trial performance, but synergistic and complementary effects of caffeine and carbohydrate. So basically, relative to the placebo, no caffeine, no carbohydrate, the caffeine and carbohydrate provided the best performance. And we've shown some of that in team sports athletes as well, with regards sprint performance or skill performance. There's the caffeine and carbohydrate seems to work better than caffeine alone or carbohydrate alone.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Different discussion. Again, today's discussion was just about caffeine.
Yeah, I remember as a kid when I was playing football in one of the tournaments that we attended, our coaches gave us cola, but not flat cola. But I can't remember people really having any issues with that. But I think we were quite lucky because that carbonated drinks really could mess you up for something like that.
Yeah, they can do. Yeah, cause lots of gastrointestinal distress. Yes.
Yeah. So, and just one more follow-up. You mentioned there all the different factors that might affect the dosage, but just to reiterate, 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram body weight is sort of the range that we're generally looking at based on the research.
Yeah, that's correct. Yes.
Let's move into the rapid fire questions, and these are just one sentence answers. And the first one is, what's your favorite book, blog, or resource?
I don't actually read sports books or anything like that, but I read lots of mindfulness books, and I think they're help in all aspects of life, especially in exercise and coming back from training and recovery and things like that. So mindfulness books, I would strongly recommend that to your listeners.
Do you have a specific favorite there?
There's a couple that I've got. I can't remember the authors, so I can't say, I'm afraid.
Okay. What's a personal habit that's helped you achieve success?
Perseverance and dog-headedness to get the job done. It builds anxiety for me, but I know my skills are about just getting the job done, and that's helped me in many ways. And
what do you wish you had known or done differently at some point in your career?
From my sporting perspective, I guess more adherence to recovery and flexibility, key fitness components that are unfortunately ignored at my peril. And I've had so many injuries playing football typically that I think if I had taken better care of myself from a flexibility and recovery perspective younger, then it would have been less problematic when I'm older.
And finally, are you on social media? Are there any places where the listeners can follow you and the research that you're doing, Twitter, ResearchGate, or anything like that you want to mention?
Yes, I am available on ResearchGate and LinkedIn, and also I have my own website, www.ajmolali.com, and you can pass the link on to your listeners afterwards. And that's got all the papers that I've published, and usually you can link through there into the journal article itself. So I do need to update that, but a lot of the caffeine papers are available on there.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ajmol, for coming on and sharing all this information. It's been really interesting to hear all of this, the research that you've done and the findings that we now know of from caffeine and endurance sports.
Thank you for your time.
I hope that you enjoyed that interview with Dr. Ali. As usual, you can find the show notes on scientifictriathlon.com, where we'll also have links to all the relevant resources, including the meta-analysis we discussed and some other papers that we mentioned as well, specific papers that were discussed. I'll also have Dr. Ali's website and his ResearchGate profile. And that's it. Go and find it on scientifictriathlon.com. Click through to podcast and the latest episode. On Thursday, we have another Q&A coming out as usual, so stay subscribed to the podcast so you don't miss anything. And then next Monday, I interview Josh Portner. And Josh is really a wealth of knowledge when it comes to many kind of technical topics around cycling. And what we will specifically discuss is, first and foremost, optimal tire pressure, which is a big topic of its own. But we also cover aerodynamics and smart equipment upgrades in general, both in terms of aerodynamics, but just generally smart equipment upgrades that will make you faster on the bike without necessarily getting fitter. What are the things that are worth investing in, and what are the things that you should only get if you've covered all the other bases? So definitely a highly recommended episode to stay tuned for. Now, there's a little less than 2 weeks left to take advantage of the Beginner Ironman training plan launch discount. So right now, until the end of May, you can get that plan for 60% off its normal price because we're still in the launch period. And especially at the time of this recording, which is early May that I'm recording this intro and outro, and actually the interview was done several weeks earlier, early April. But still right now, I don't really know when any of us might actually be racing. But at some point, we will be racing, whether it's this year or next year. So if you are planning on doing an Ironman and it might be your first, or it might be your fourth or fifth, but you're still kind of more towards the back of the pack, so you would consider yourself a beginner in that sense, then take this opportunity to get this plan now while it's heavily discounted during this launch period, which lasts until the end of May. You can find it on scientifictriathlon.com on the training plans page. Big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Take the free online sweat test and get 15% off your order of electrolyte products with the promo code ThatTriathlonShow15. And thank you to Roka that you can find on roka.com. Check out their wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, and high-performance eyewear, and prescription eyeglasses and sunglasses. And get 20% off your order with the promo code that you can find on roka.com/TTS. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart, keep loving triathlon.